Thank you so much. And I have a PowerPoint. If it stops or freezes, then I will just speak. But we'll see if this works. And this is basically just a presentation a little bit on metrics of poverty and disability. But then also at the end, trying to link back to some of our conversations yesterday, pointing out the spiritual aspects that are missing from the conversations that we are engaged with as people who work primarily on measurement. And my empirical work is joined with Mónica Pinilla Vergancia, based in Colombia. I think the basic point, we would all know that systematically disability and poverty are linked, and particularly in developing countries, usually levels of poverty are higher among households that include somebody living with disabilities than they are in the households without those persons. And those relationships persist when we consider gender, the type of disability involved, and if we look at monetary poverty or other measures of poverty. So that's a general picture, but there is it's based on very patchy data. And so as we know, disability is one kind of challenge, but there are others, and these inequalities can intersect. An older person with disabilities, a woman or a child with disabilities will have different conditions because of these intersecting identities. Something I'll come back to is that also, although the literature focuses on disaggregating by disabilities, we also have to talk about situations that create them. I presume that Father Pedrera will talk more about the costs, but Amartya Sen has pointed us to the space of functioning, which is what a person is able to do and be, as the appropriate space in which to measure human well-being and evaluate it. And one of the reasons he argues for doing that is the example of a person with disability. If I have a bike and the bike is red and I love my bike, one might think I can get around with my bike. And so I do, I have the ability to move around. And then I'm happy because I like the exercise and I like the wind in the air. But if I have a bike and I have no legs, or I'm terrified of traffic, or I don't have a sense of balance, then the ability of a resource to convert my capabilities into functionings is missed. And so by focusing on what people are able to do and be, it means that economists need to get them there, even if the cost of providing mobility for persons living with disability could be higher. But to do all of these policies, of course, we need data. And a very common topic in the literature on disability about policy responses is not only what policies are required to support them, coming back to our discussion yesterday of liberation, of support and solidarity, and enabling them to live a vocation of fulfillment and give back in different ways. But another point is the lack of data, that we often don't know the size of or the character of the problem. And that's particularly acute when we come to poverty and hunger. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, what's interesting is that they do 7 targets and 11 indicators of the SDGs explicitly articulate the need to consider the condition of persons living with disabilities. However, very often the data required to do so do not exist. And so there's been a working group in the UN, interagency working group on SDG indicators, trying to understand and articulate how these data could be gathered. And so I'll show part of the problem of doing so, and then also just a little bit of new data that are coming out, and then end with some of the more profound questions that this empirical line of work misses. In our group, we do a global measure, as some of you will know, of multidimensional poverty, which looks at which of 10 indicators a person is deprived in. And if they and their household are deprived in a critical mass, 1/3 of those indicators, then they are identified as poor. And the indicators are conditions like somebody in the household is undernourished. Very sadly, a child has died in the last 5 years. Nobody in the household has 6 years of schooling. A child is not attending school up to class 8. They have unsafe drinking water, inadequate sanitation, no electricity, poor quality housing, solid cooking fuel, and lack of basic assets like a radio, television, telephone, animal cart, computer, refrigerator, bicycle, or motorcycle. And so this measure covers 6.1 billion people this year. It's disaggregated extensively by different characteristics, but not at the moment by disability status. We have trends for 5.5 billion people, again, disaggregated. But at the moment, we only have comparable data as of this year for 10 countries. And so what we've done is both to complain about it, but also to show what can be done if we analyze those data a bit further, and also what is missed out entirely, like the relationality that Fabio mentioned, and the participation, nothing about us without us, that he also mentioned and that came up yesterday in a number of the presentations. So first of all, in previous work with Monica Pinilla-Vorgancia, who did her doctorate on disability, we analyzed all the data that we could, but the definitions of disability were not comparable. And so a step forward is that we are able now to compare. Just to give you a global view before we go to the 10 countries that we cover, the global measures cover 110 countries, 6.1 billion people, and 1.1 billion live in acute poverty, slightly more than the number we've been hearing experience disabilities, which is 1 billion, 15% of the global population. And just over 18% of the people in the developing world live in this very acute condition, and half of them are children. So children are clearly an important group for both disability and poverty. Most, as well, one would consider, are in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, South Asia, but the data in sub-Saharan Africa are 2.5 years older. And so it might be that there's more parity between the regions. And there, although we said in some of the conversations yesterday that these acute conditions of health might be going away and we need to focus on non-communicable diseases, etc. 600 million people live in a household where at least one person is undernourished and they are poor. And hundreds of millions also live in that condition, but they don't have the nexus of other deprivations collected at the same time. So we have to remember that the numbers living in very acute conditions of poverty are still quite high. So we focus on disaggregating the global measure by each of the indicators, of course, to see what is the composition of poverty. The reddish color are the health, the mauve in the middle are the education, and the blue are the living standard. And we can see visually that the height of the bar for the overall poverty is highest in sub-Saharan Africa. But then in sub-Saharan Africa, we can pull it apart, with Niger having the highest poverty and Seychelles having the lowest. But if we take something in the middle, like Senegal, for example, Kafrine has the highest poverty and Dakar, of course, the lowest. And so when we disaggregate, we can just look within a continent, or we can look within a country to show the disparities. And that's what we would like also to be able to do for people living with disabilities, to see how much higher or lower. I mentioned half of the world's poor are children. In every country, almost, children are poorer, statistically significantly poorer. In some, they are the same, but in no country are adults significantly poorer than children. And so that's just two categories, adults and children. So we want to do the same with people with disabilities. And as I mentioned, we can only access 10 data sets for this at the moment. Cambodia, Colombia, Haiti, Maldives, Mali, Nigeria, Pakistan, Senegal, Timor-Leste, and Uganda. And you see that those data are a little bit old, but they cover 600 million people, thanks largely, as we will know, to Nigeria and Pakistan, very large populous countries. And of those 610 million, 220 million are poor. So these are significantly higher than the global average. Nigeria has more recent data, 2021 data, but it doesn't have data on disability in the mix. So building on what Matilda Leonardi said yesterday, we use what the SDG Convention has requested for disability disaggregation, which are 6 questions. Do you have difficulty seeing, even if you are wearing glasses? And you can say, no, no difficulty, or yes, some difficulty, or yes, a lot of difficulty, or I can't do it at all. If you answer yes, a lot, or I can't do it at all, then to any one of these 6 categories, you are considered to have a disability. So this is a very simplified, we know it's inaccurate, but it's the best we can do across a lot of countries to try to get comparable data. So this is what has been advised coming out of the ICF classification. So what percentage of people in those 10 countries live in a household where somebody experiences a disability? It ranges from 5.2% in Nigeria, though other data sets have different figures, up to 30% in Pakistan and Colombia, countries with significant conflict where there's often dismemberment, so difficulties in mobility and other conditions. So we've disaggregated them, and the yellow are people who share their household with somebody experiencing disabilities. We can also do this at the individual level, but part of the philosophy is caring and sharing. And we want to think that people in households care about each other. And so we've deliberately chosen to do this at the household level. What's interesting is that in 6 of the countries, or 7 if we consider the headcount ratio, poverty is significantly higher among households with disabilities in Cambodia, Haiti, Nigeria, Senegal, Timor-Leste, Uganda, and Pakistan, if we consider the headcount ratio. So, for example, going to the headcount, which is easiest to understand, in Mali, you can see it's not the case. So the blue bar is higher than the yellow bar. But if you go to the far right, Timor-Leste, you see the yellow bar is about 59%, and the blue bar is about 47%. And so there's a significantly higher proportion of the population of Timor-Leste who are poor if they share their house with somebody living with disabilities. We think that when we extend this to many more countries, that the number of significant differences will rise. And we have some insights into Mali and Colombia and the challenges of the data there. But this is work in progress, and we have to wait until the data come in. Another question is whether the composition of poverty for people living with disabilities is different in terms of the 10 indicators we cover than the composition of the other households. And actually, we found it was not. We found that while a greater share of people living with disabilities are poor, the composition of their poverty is quite similar. The gray bars in this diagram are school attendance, and they're quite high, particularly in Senegal and Mali, Nigeria, Pakistan. And the yellow bar of households without having anybody who has completed 6 years of schooling are again quite high. So I could say a lot more on the data, but I'd like to really try to draw it back to the focus on inclusion. So I'm going to leave that and go back to our discussion. I think one point which came up, as I mentioned earlier, and continues to come up, is the need for poverty data and for disability status data. And there's been a call for a data revolution. We're having a conference in Oxford on February because it's not happening when it comes to poverty. Niger is our poorest country, and their data date to 2012. This year we dropped Burkina Faso and South Sudan because their data were too old for us to use at 2010. We have, if you go to Forbes.com/billionaires, you get data every hour on the income of billionaires. But for the poorest people in countries, we don't have those data. And also, as we've said, for the marginalized groups like disability, people with disability, even 6 questions is not included in many of the data sets that the UN offices themselves produce. So there's a need for advocacy in a light way. It's not the main point of this group, but just to be aware. Because Kokunya was in the call, I wanted to mention that we also have the privilege to work with about 45 countries that work on tailor-made national multidimensional poverty measures. And Nigeria launched its MPI last year. And it's one of the countries that does disaggregate by disability status, not in a way that can be compared to other countries, but in a way that can be disaggregated to the 109 senatorial districts of Nigeria. And they found that 71% of people living with a disability are poor compared to 62% of the rest. So it is, again, significantly higher. There's a whole section of the report covering that. Sri Lanka has it, Nepal has it, Bhutan. We're trying to encourage all of the countries to at least cover these data. But to be now self-critical, this leaves a lot out. First of all, yesterday, we spoke so much about relationality. And there are a number of books, Kim Samuel's book of On Belonging, Social Isolation, Social Connectedness, Eric Varden's lovely work on the shattering of loneliness, are examples. But when they came together and discussed it, they suggested that when we come to considering poverty and defining indeed multidimensional poverty, that belonging might be and a lack of belonging, a sense of social isolation, might be indeed an aspect of poverty. I can talk more about the measurement. It is measured in many countries as an aspect of well-being. For example, in the UK, the measures are not wonderful, but they're getting there. So that might also be something is to recognize that certain aspects of people living with disability and their isolation is also a characteristic of poverty, among others. Another strand is that we talked about, Anna Marta mentioned the book Living with My Daughter, and a number of people talked about how they learned from people experiencing disabilities in their own household. And so thinking of leaders like Juan Manuel Santos, Ana Elena Chacon from Costa Rica, former vice president whose daughter has Down syndrome. These leaders can be people who can take work forward because they also have a lived understanding of these conditions, but profiling them, supporting them, enabling their voice to carry is a very different level than the policy work that we usually do. And last slide is just some observations as somebody who completely focuses on numbers, on UN definitions, on the secular world of poverty. The conversation, first of all, focuses on how to support people living with disabilities in different conditions. So if you look at the literature on people living with disabilities and war, it's all about how to support them. Nazreen, you will know her from Syria, the very famous woman with her sister who got out of Syria, but in a wheelchair. Beautiful voice and beautiful advocate. And yet a missing thread of that is that situations create disabilities. And I mentioned Colombia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, we could also say, but in places where there has been conflict, these are creating disabilities. And that's a little bit absent from the literature, maybe a thread we could draw out. But I think more worryingly, what Monsignor Mirat opened with us, the spiritual dimension of the lives of people with disabilities, their wonder, their compassion, the fact that they can remind us that when I'm weak, I'm strong. We have this treasure in earthen vessels. We're all fragile. How that is really a catalyst among us, and that is completely missing from my literature, the world of looking at poverty, looking at disability. It's all how to solve a problem, how to support a marginalized group. And so Sister Helen's comment yesterday of the need to bring together and rebalance those would be distinctive in the reading that we've done. To loop back to a couple other points from yesterday, the participatory relational empowering process is in some cases recognized, in some cases not, in the response. but it is, I think, something this group has brought out very strongly. Another comment is the need to not compete with other marginalized groups. So how do we advocate for people living with disabilities alongside others instead of competing with them? So my 20 minutes are up, and I'll stop there, but thank you so much. I'm sure this is only a little bit of what all of you will know. Thank you.